Welcome to HardScript.
Help me reach 5,000 subscribers. Support the video with a like and leave your thoughts in the comments. My wife called me screaming while I was sitting in my car outside a quiet cafe downtown. "Why aren't you home yet?" she shouted, her voice cutting through the speaker like glass. I looked at the time. It was 7:48 p.m. Not late enough for suspicion, but too late for panic. I said nothing for a moment. Then I replied, calm and steady, "Met someone. Be home soon." I ended the call before she could say another word. My name's Daniel Reed, 38, project engineer, married for 9 years. And in that moment, I knew my marriage was over. Not because she yelled, but because I finally understood why she cared so much about when I got home. For weeks, things had felt wrong. Unexplained late nights, locked phone screens, sudden defensiveness over harmless questions. The perfume that lingered on her when she said she'd just been running errands. I hadn't wanted to believe it, not really. But denial only lasts until the evidence starts to breathe on its own. It started small, a name that popped up too often on her messages. "A coworker," she said. "Someone from accounting." His name was Eric. I didn't confront her. I just observed. I started leaving for work earlier, coming home later, watching the pattern unfold like clockwork. When I finally checked the phone bill, I didn't even need to scroll far. Dozens of calls, texts past midnight. So when she called me that night, angry, controlling, pretending I was the problem, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her. I just said I'd met someone. And in a way, I had. Her name was Rebecca, Eric's wife. We'd met the week before by accident, or maybe fate, if you believe in that kind of thing. She'd noticed the same strange behavior, the same absences, the same shift in her husband's tone when my wife's name came up. She reached out to me on Facebook, said we should talk. I agreed, not out of spite, but out of curiosity. Tonight, as I sat across from her in that cafe, I realized something cold and certain. Our partners hadn't just betrayed us. They'd made a mistake assuming we'd never find each other. When I finally drove home, Rebecca was in the passenger seat. She didn't say a word. Neither did I. But when my wife opened the door and saw who walked in beside me, her face told me everything I needed to know. When I walked through the front door that night, the house smelled like her perfume, sweet, artificial, and almost suffocating. Melissa stood at the kitchen counter, her phone in her hand, pretending to look surprised. She froze when she saw Rebecca beside me. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I didn't shout. I didn't even look angry. I just said, "You asked why I wasn't home yet." My voice was calm, but the silence that followed was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Rebecca stayed quiet, her eyes fixed on Melissa. I could see her jaw tighten. There was no satisfaction there, just exhaustion. The kind that comes from realizing the person you trusted most built their life around lies. Melissa finally spoke. She said she didn't know what was going on, that we must be confused. Her hands were shaking, but her tone was still rehearsed, like she'd practiced denial for weeks. I didn't respond. Instead, I pulled out my phone, scrolled to a series of photos Rebecca had shown me earlier that day. Her husband's car parked outside our house, same nights, same times. Proof layered over proof. Melissa stared at the screen. For a moment, the mask cracked. Then she looked at Rebecca, almost pleading. But Rebecca didn't flinch. She just said, quietly, "You took my husband. You didn't think I'd come find you." Melissa started crying then, the kind of crying meant to confuse, to make you feel like the villain for finding the truth. I didn't move to comfort her. I'd done that too many times before, when the problem wasn't mine to fix. I told her I'd be staying somewhere else that night. She asked if we could talk. I said we already were. As I left, Rebecca followed me out. Neither of us spoke until we reached the car. She said it felt strange, winning nothing but still feeling free. I understood exactly what she meant. That night, I didn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling of the hotel room, hearing her voice replay in my head. "Why aren't you home yet?" The truth was simple. I was, just not in hers anymore. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The city was still dark, the kind of quiet that presses against the walls. My phone had 6 missed calls from Melissa and 3 voicemails, all variations of the same thing, apologies wrapped in panic. I didn't listen to any of them. Instead, I stared at my reflection in the hotel mirror. I didn't look angry. I looked detached, like someone who'd finally stopped trying. Around 8, Rebecca called. Her voice was steady, but I could tell she hadn't slept either. She said Eric hadn't come home. He'd packed a bag and disappeared after she confronted him. She didn't sound sad, only resolved. She said she was done chasing reasons. I told her I understood. I went back to the house later that day, not to argue, not to forgive, but to collect what was mine. Melissa was there, waiting in the kitchen. The same table where we'd planned vacations, birthdays, and mortgage payments now looked like a stage set for something that never really existed. She started to speak, but I held up my hand. I told her I wasn't there for explanations. I wanted clarity, not conversation. She said she'd made a mistake, that it didn't mean anything. I looked at her then, really looked, and realized I didn't believe a single word. Not because she was lying now, but because lying had become her language. It wasn't something she did. It was who she'd become. I packed my things quietly. Clothes, files, a few photographs that didn't feel poisoned by memory. When I was done, she asked if I was leaving for good. I said that depended on how honest she decided to be from this point forward. She didn't answer. As I walked out the door, the weight on my chest lifted just enough to breathe again. The air outside felt colder, but clean. Rebecca texted later, saying she'd filed for separation. She said she wasn't going to let betrayal define her. I told her she was right. That night, I drove to the coast and sat by the water until the sky turned pale. I didn't cry. I didn't think about revenge. I thought about quiet, the kind that comes after you finally stop living in someone else's noise. For the next few days, the silence between us became its own language. Melissa kept calling, sending long messages that began with apologies and ended with blame. She said she didn't know why she'd done it, that she'd felt unseen, that maybe it was my fault too. I didn't respond. Every word she sent was another reminder of how far gone we were. Rebecca and I stayed in touch, not as partners in pain, but as people who understood the same kind of wreckage. We met twice after that, once for coffee, once to hand each other copies of documents we might need for divorce proceedings. There was no flirtation, no shared bitterness, just a quiet understanding. We were both cleaning up someone else's mess. By the end of the week, Melissa showed up at the hotel. She stood in the lobby like a stranger, holding a box of my things I hadn't taken. Books, a few tools, a photo of us from years ago, back when everything still looked simple. I told her to leave it at the desk. She said she just wanted to talk. I told her I wasn't ready to hear anything that started with, "I can explain." She cried again. This time, I didn't look away. Not because I felt sympathy, but because I wanted to remember this version of her, the one stripped of excuses. For years, she'd controlled the narrative, the tempo, the tone. Now, she was running out of words, and all I had left was silence. That night, I started drafting my own plan. I wasn't going to shout or drag this through the mud. I was going to separate with precision. Every asset, every document, every shared account. I went through them all. Methodical, cold, calm. The same way I handled every engineering project. The difference was that this time, the blueprint wasn't for building something. It was for dismantling it. When I closed my laptop, I felt something unexpected. Not rage, not victory, just balance. The scales had evened out. Melissa once told me that silence made her nervous, that she needed noise to feel alive. So, I decided I'd give her exactly what she feared most. The silence worked faster than I expected. Within a week, Melissa started unraveling. The calls stopped being angry and turned desperate. Then came the messages from mutual friends. She was asking around, trying to find out if I was seeing someone. I wasn't, but I let her wonder. People like her can't stand not being in control of the story. I moved my things out quietly. No drama, no confrontation. I hired a moving service while she was at work and left a single envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside were the divorce papers and a note that said only, "I wish you clarity." Not closure. Clarity. Because closure is emotional. Clarity is factual. The next day, she showed up at my office. She looked tired, unpolished, and smaller than I remembered. She said she'd signed the papers. Then she asked if I'd ever loved her at all. I told her I did once. But I'd been loving the idea of her, not the person she became. She didn't argue. She just nodded, like she finally understood something she'd been avoiding for years. After she left, I sat there for a long time, staring at the envelope she'd handed me. Her signature was neat, steady. Even in defeat, she wanted to look composed. That's who she was, someone who cared more about appearances than truth. That night, Rebecca called again. She said her divorce hearing was set for next month. She sounded lighter, like she'd finally stepped out of a fog. She said she was grateful we'd crossed paths, even under these circumstances. I told her the same. We didn't need to say more. When I got off the phone, I drove back to the house one last time. It was empty, cold, and smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals. I stood in the doorway, remembering the night she called me yelling, "Why aren't you home yet?" And the way that question used to make me feel guilty. Now, it just sounded ironic. Because somewhere along the way, I realized I hadn't left home. I'd just stopped living in a place that was never really mine. A few weeks passed before the real quiet settled in. Not the kind that comes from distance, but the kind that comes when you finally stop reacting. My phone stayed still. No calls. No apologies. No reminders of what I'd lost. Just silence. And in that silence, something started to rebuild itself. I'd moved into a small apartment near the edge of town. Nothing special. Sparse furniture, clean walls, no photographs. For the first time in years, the space around me matched the space inside me, uncluttered. I spent my evenings walking the same route by the river, the one I used to drive past on my way home to her. Funny how peaceful it felt now that I didn't have to rush anywhere. Rebecca texted occasionally. She'd finalized her divorce. She said she was moving to another city to start a new job. She thanked me again for being kind through it all. I told her kindness wasn't hard when the war was already over. She sent back a single line. Some battles end in silence. She was right. One afternoon, I ran into Eric by accident. He was at a gas station off the interstate, standing by a beat-up sedan that didn't match the man my wife once risked everything for. He saw me before I saw him. For a second, neither of us spoke. He gave a quick nod, half apology, half surrender, and got in his car without saying a word. That was enough. That night, I went home and sat by the window as the sun dipped behind the buildings. I thought about everything. How betrayal doesn't happen in an instant, but in inches. How silence can either destroy you or save you, depending on how you use it. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger takes energy, and I'd finally learned where to spend mine. Before going to bed, I found myself scrolling through old photos, our wedding, vacations, moments that used to feel like proof. I deleted them one by one, not out of spite, but out of acceptance. And as the screen went black, I realized something I hadn't understood before. Sometimes the cleanest revenge isn't starting over louder, it's ending quietly. By spring, the divorce was finalized. The papers came in a plain envelope with the county seal pressed faintly into the corner. I didn't open it right away. I just placed it on the table, next to my coffee, and let it sit there for a few hours. When I finally did, it felt like flipping the last page of a book I'd already memorized. Melissa kept her last name. That was fine. She got the house. I didn't care. What mattered to me wasn't what I lost. It was what I didn't carry anymore. The weight, the pretending, the noise. Work picked up quickly after that. My focus sharpened in ways I hadn't felt in years. My boss mentioned a promotion, said my attention to detail had become an asset to the company. I almost laughed. If only he knew where I'd learned it. From years of reading between the lies of someone I loved. One Friday evening, I left work early and drove past the old neighborhood. The house was the same, except for the new car in the driveway and a few plants she'd added near the porch. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of movement. A man's silhouette, taller than me, moving comfortably inside. I didn't slow down. I didn't need to know who he was. Some things answer themselves. That night, I sat on my balcony and watched the city light up one window at a time. Somewhere out there, Melissa was probably doing the same, convincing herself she was happy, convincing him she'd changed. But the thing about people who live on noise, they can't survive in stillness. Eventually, the silence catches up. Rebecca called again that week. She said she'd settled into her new city, that she was rebuilding. There was something steady in her voice, something healed. She asked how I was doing. I told her I'd stopped counting days since everything ended. That's when she said something that stuck with me. Maybe that means it really ended. After the call, I sat there thinking about that word, ended. How it sounded final, but didn't feel final. Because the truth is, endings aren't loud. They don't crash or burn. They fade. And if you're lucky, you learn to fade with them, quietly, until the past becomes just another sound you no longer turn toward. A few months later, I ran into Melissa by accident. It was at a grocery store across town, a place neither of us used to go. She was standing in the frozen foods aisle, looking at something she probably didn't need. For a second, I thought about turning around, pretending not to see her. But she noticed me first. She smiled, that same practice smile, the one that used to work on me when she needed to steer the conversation. I nodded once, polite, detached. She asked how I'd been, how work was going, if I was still living on the quiet side of town. I told her yes. Then I asked how she'd been. She said she was doing fine. The word fell out of her mouth too quickly, too rehearsed. She mentioned that the man she'd been seeing, Eric, had moved out a few weeks ago. She said it wasn't what she'd expected, that he'd become distant, cold. I didn't say what I was thinking, that she'd built her world on betrayal, and now she was just tasting her own version of it. Instead, I told her I hoped she found peace. She looked at me then, for a long time. Maybe she wanted me to be angry, to still care. But I'd run out of energy for that kind of emotion. When she realized she wasn't going to get a reaction, she smiled again, weaker this time, and walked away. I stood there for a moment after she left, staring at the empty aisle. The hum of the refrigerators filled the silence. It was strange, seeing the person who once defined your life reduced to just another stranger buying dinner. That's when I understood something final. Closure doesn't come when they apologize. It comes when you realize you no longer need them to. That night, I sat on my balcony again, watching the river in the distance. The city lights rippled across the surface, slow and steady. I thought about all the noise we create trying to prove something to the people who hurt us. And how, in the end, the only real victory is silence. The kind that doesn't hide bitterness, but peace. The kind that says, I'm done explaining what you chose not to understand. Weeks passed after that encounter, and I didn't think about Melissa much. The mind has a strange way of healing itself when you stop feeding it reasons to reopen the wound. Work became my rhythm again, predictable, controlled, clean. I built things that stayed together, systems that didn't lie. There was comfort in that symmetry. But one night, I got an email from an unknown address. The subject line was simple: I'm sorry. I knew who it was before I opened it. Melissa's words filled the screen, long and winding, the kind of apology that comes too late to matter. She said she'd been trying to understand what went wrong, that she'd ruined everything good in her life, that she missed who we used to be. She wrote that she hoped I'd found someone better. I stared at the message for a while. There was a time I would have read every word twice, dissecting each sentence for sincerity. Not now. I scrolled once, all the way to the bottom, and closed it without replying. I didn't need to be the man who gave her peace. That wasn't my role anymore. A few days later, Rebecca texted me for the first time in months. She said she'd met someone new, someone kind. She sounded nervous, like she didn't want it to sound like a betrayal. I told her I was glad. I meant it. Her voice on the phone was lighter, freer. We'd both escaped something heavy, and now we were just learning how to stand again. That evening, I drove out to the coast, the same stretch of road I'd gone to the night I left Melissa. The ocean was quiet, the horizon soft with fading light. I stood there, hands in my pockets, listening to the steady pull of the tide. It felt like the world was breathing at its own pace, and for once, I was in sync with it. No revenge, no anger, just calm. I realized something as I stood there. The moment you stop needing the other person to feel your pain, you finally start healing. And healing, I've learned, is just silence finding its shape again. It's been almost a year since that night, since the phone call, the yelling, the discovery, and the silence that followed. Sometimes it feels like it all happened to someone else. Like I was just watching a version of myself from a distance, a man trapped inside a house built on lies and denial. But the truth is, I remember every second. Not the shouting or the betrayal, but the stillness afterward. The quiet. Life has a way of repairing itself if you stop interfering with it. The pieces don't go back the same way. They never do, but they form something cleaner, stronger. My apartment feels like that now. Everything has a place. No clutter. No hidden corners. Just space and air. I still think about Melissa sometimes, but only in flashes. A laugh. A scent. The way she used to stir her coffee twice before taking a sip. But it's not longing, it's recognition. She was a part of a chapter that closed exactly when it needed to. From what I've heard, she moved out of the old house and started over somewhere new. I hope she learns what silence really means. As for me, I kept walking the quiet road. I started mentoring younger engineers at work, teaching them what I wish I'd known earlier, that discipline isn't just about control. It's about patience. It's about learning when not to respond. The world doesn't reward noise. It rewards precision. One night, I got a text from Rebecca. No explanation, just a photo of the ocean. The same view I'd stood in front of when everything fell apart. Underneath it, 2 words, peace found. I looked at it for a long time before typing my reply. I wrote, same here. Then I set the phone down, walked out onto the balcony, and watched the city breathe beneath me. The same city where everything had broken apart now felt like the only place I'd ever belonged. People think revenge is fire, that it burns through the past and clears the way for peace. But they're wrong. Fire destroys everything. Silence, though, it rebuilds. And sometimes, the quietest endings echo the loudest. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.